recording now. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Mark Mallalieu is County Recorder for the Sussex Ornithological Society, and he's the chair of its scientific committee. He's had an interesting life. He spent almost 40 years with the UK's Department for International Development, often living overseas and most recently in Afghanistan. Now he's retired and he's based in Sussex, and he's got a particular interest in scarce breeding birds in the county. He's published a number of papers on the birds of Sussex and Africa and Asia. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand you over to Mark for what's going to prove a really interesting talk. So over to you, Mark. Hi, are you?
Yeah, I think I'm
okay? Yep.
good to go.
Right.
Yep.
Yep, that looks good. And it's saying it's coming through, so it should be, yep, here we are. And then if we just put it onto the full size.
Yeah. Okay, well, I hope you can all hear me. First of all, hello, and thank you to the London Natural History Society for inviting me to give this talk. I hope to inspire you to go out and find hawfinches and goshawks in Sussex or maybe elsewhere. I thought I should start with a map of Sussex. It's obviously just to the south of your recording area, and two notable landscape features are the high-wheeled area of outstanding natural beauty and the green hatching, and of course the South Downs National Park. And it's a well-wooded county, which is very relevant for both of these species. So this is the hawfinch to start with. So imagine you're out in the countryside in winter and you see a stocky, short-tailed, large-headed bird almost the size of a redwing perched right at the top of a tree. Well, you may have found a hawfinch. They can overlap in weight with a redwing. They're twice as heavy as a chaffinch, and the huge bill is immediately obvious. It's used for cracking open fruit stones that no other British bird can open. If you have found a hawfinch, when it flies, it will show lots of white in the wing and a white tip to the tail. And you can see that in this photograph. It's not a gaudy bird, but it has these rather lovely pastel tones and deep purple blue iridescence on some of the flight feathers, although you're unlikely to see that in the field. And note also those very curious club-shaped extensions on the inner primaries. Nobody really knows what the purpose of those is. This is a male hawfinch, and this is a female, slightly less bright, and with that grey panel in the secondaries, which is diagnostic of a female. Now, hawfinches are incredibly shy and usually very, very elusive. So to see them, you really need to understand their behavior and foods. And you also need to get to know their calls. So I'm going to attempt to imitate the two most common calls. It's got a really loud tick, tick, which is a bit like a robin, but a lot louder and kind of more explosive. And then quite incongruously, it's got a very quiet see call, which is like a redwing's, but shorter. And as I said, it's most incongruous going with such a chunky finch. Now, I took those photographs from a hide, and you really won't see hawfinches like that under normal conditions. You're much more likely to see them perched at the top of trees. Hawfinches don't need to feed all day long. They seem to have lots of spare time, and some of that spare time they use sitting at the tops of trees, which is why I said at the beginning about looking for them right at treetops. But why study hawfinches? There are two superb monographs. There's one in the New Naturalist series. You can buy that for about £700 on the internet. A few copies are a bit cheaper. And also a wonderful monograph written by somebody in what was then East Germany, Der Kernbeißer, which is much more recent than Guy Mountford's book. It is a superb reference. Now, hawfinches are not rare globally. They're a species of least conservation concern, according to IUCN and BirdLife International. They're found from Northwest Africa through the Iberian Peninsula, right across Europe and Asia to Japan. But in Britain, it's a very different story. They've declined by about 76% over the last 40 years. So a catastrophic decline in numbers, and it's a red listed species of conservation concern in Britain. Oddly enough, though, the research that the RSPB has done recently has found that in the places where hawfinches still occur in Britain in good numbers, the New Forest, for example, and parts of Wales, you may have seen some on Autumn Watch recently, they're actually doing quite well, and their reproductive success is enough to sustain the population. But elsewhere in Britain, it's a very different story. And I should also say that there's an immigration of hawfinches into Britain in the winter, which is not well understood, but certainly several thousands of hawfinches arrive on our shores each autumn. Now, Sussex is really typical of the main British picture. So this is a map from the 2007 to 2011 atlas, and the bird had become vanishingly scarce, possibly on the brink of extinction, and it had become very, very difficult to find. Really, bird watchers had lost the ability to find hawfinches away from one famous site in West Sussex, at Westdean, north of Chichester, where everybody was going to see them. Now, to me, this was a tremendous opportunity in my retirement. I thought, well, it can't really be as bad as that. I really want to go and find some hawfinches. And I couldn't have chosen a better time to make that decision. I made that decision in September 2017. And in October 2017, Britain experienced the largest influx of these birds in living memory. And who would have guessed that the species would have featured in the Waitrose in-store magazine? There you are, the Arnold Schwarzenegger of the finch world. So I chose this. I decided to use this opportunity to learn as much as I could about hawfinches in the county, and I hope to use that knowledge after the influx to learn whether they were really as scarce and almost extinct as the record suggested. So off I went. Now, the first thing I discovered that the winter world of the hawfinch in East Sussex revolves around this. It's a hornbeam fruit cluster, and they're pairs of bracts, about 6 bracts, each containing a nutlet. Now, hornbeam is very widespread in central and East Sussex, particularly in the Weald and in northwest Sussex. And I found that wherever I found fruiting hornbeam, I found hawfinches. They absolutely love this seed, which is, it can be taken by chaffinches and greenfinches, for example, but it's much more difficult for them to consume, to open the seeds than it is for the hawfinch. So more or less, the hawfinches have got this food to themselves. The reason it's common in Sussex is that it was, although it is an indigenous tree, it was used in the charcoal and iron smelting industries in the Weald. So there's an awful lot of coppice. So it's very, very widespread. And this for a hawfinch is heaven. Hornbeams come into leaf early and they lose their leaves early. So this was in October 2017. And there are hundreds, probably thousands of seeds just in that photograph. So my first tip for finding hawfinches is get to know where the hornbeams are in your area. Once you get to know how to identify hornbeam, it's actually quite a distinctive tree, so you won't have any trouble identifying it, even when it hasn't got any leaves on. 2 caveats though. The first one is that this tree does not fruit unless it gets lots of sun. So where you have coppice, in the interior of that coppice, there won't be any seed. And also, it often occurs in oak hornbeam woodland. And in that case, it's overshadowed by the oaks and doesn't have any seed either. So you do need to find hornbeam that is getting sun and therefore has seed. So first tip, get to know your local hornbeam. And that's just a map of its distribution in Sussex. It's almost ubiquitous in the High Weald and in the northwest of the county, less common in the west. And you can see a gap there. If you know where Ashdown Forest is in the north, there's a gap there as well. The next tree that's really important is yew. Now, you probably know that these berries, they're called arils, are much loved by thrushes. And you might think that there'd be competition between the 2 species, but as I'll say in a moment, there isn't. The first important thing to say about yew is it's a dioecious species, so the male and female flowers are on separate trees. So you do need to be looking for female yew trees. And also, a bit like hornbeam, not all the trees the female trees have an equal amount of fruit. So you need to find the ewes that have lots of fruit on them. And they are feeding at the moment in Sussex. They are busily feeding on ewes. Now, this is a fieldfare, not a hawfinch. So as I said, you might think that there's competition between thrushes like redwings, fieldfares, blackbirds, and especially ring-ouzels. They're famous for taking ewe. But actually there isn't really, because what the hawfinches do, as well as feeding directly on the seeds, so they don't want the red fruits, they want the embryos inside the seeds. They follow the thrush flocks around and they pick the seeds out of the thrush poo. So each bit of thrush poo will have about 6 seeds in it. And if you think about it, that's a pretty efficient way of gathering food. Now, in March 2018, Sussex had a concentration of 400 hawfinches at Kingley Vale, which was the second largest in the country, because the largest concentration was in your recording area, so Bramble Hall Wood on the North Downs, where an extraordinary total of 600 was counted. So you can see that yew is a very important tree for hawfinches. And of course, it's the tree that you find in churchyards. I found 2 wonderful websites, one called Sussex Parish Churches and also an ancient yew inventory. And using that, I worked out that there are about 400 churches in Sussex, rural churches, that might have yews suitable for hawfinches. And I searched quite a lot of them. Unfortunately, the yew inventory doesn't tell you whether the trees are male or female. But apart from that, it was very useful. This is at Stopham near Pulborough, and this is a yew tree that, who knows, is maybe 1,000 years old, and it's a female yew. And of course, during the influx year, it did have hawfinches in it. So from the survey work we did, we reckoned that about 35% of the churches, rural churches in Sussex, held hawfinches. So probably the churchyards altogether had a population of about 400 hawfinches during the influx. So that's yew. So hornbeam and yew, get to know where they are locally and the right sort. Now, the next food source may come as a bit of a surprise. This is field maple, Acer campestre, which is very widespread in Sussex, and it may be widespread in your recording area in London. I don't actually know. And hawfinches like this almost as much as hornbeam. So when they've got both foods available, you'll see them flying from one tree species to the other, swapping the food that they're eating just for a bit of variety, I guess. And this is a picture I took in December 2017. And as you can see, almost all the field maple has already gone. And I found that by December 2017, I couldn't see any field maple seed anywhere. And the hawfinches, I think, were partly responsible for that, if not entirely responsible. So I'm just going to use this slide to talk about most of the other foods that hawfinches take in winter. Cherry is a bit of a mystery because a lot of the colloquial names for hawfinch on the continent, for example, have the word cherry in them, or for example in German Kirsch, so Kirschbeißer, Kirschknupper. But in Sussex, I found remarkably little evidence that they're taking cherry. I'm sure they are. This is wild cherry. I have found stones that have been cracked open by hawfinches, but much less than I would have expected. I think part of the issue is that you don't get woods full of cherry. It's just an isolated tree or clumps of cherry within other tree species. And also, there are no orchards left in Sussex, apart from one which is covered by netting all through the summer. So the trees are scattered around, and it's more difficult to find hawfinches feeding on them, I suspect. The next food source I should mention is beech mast. Now, beech is a really fickle tree, so you don't get mast every year. But the evidence suggests that in good beech mast years, it's an important food source for hawfinches. And I should also have said in relation to hornbeam that it does generally fruit very well every year, but some years it fails. And coincidentally, this year, 2020, in East Sussex, and possibly throughout the whole county and beyond, the crop has completely failed. So places where I would have expected to find hawfinches, I'm not going to find them. Other foods that are important are sloe, holly, hawthorn, that's where the bird gets its name in Britain, ivy they can take, rose hips, mistletoe, and they're incredibly adaptable. So even if those food sources aren't available, they'll start eating the fresh growth of leaves and even needles of Norway spruce or yew, and they'll also take buds. What do they eat in the summer? Well, I haven't really studied it in the summer, but I know from the reading that I've done that two moth larvae are really important, the oak leaf roller moth and the winter moth. Now, you may have worked out for yourselves that hawfinches don't have a problem finding food in winter. Even during the influx year, there didn't seem to be much of a problem when there were 10 or 20 times as many as normal. So if there's a problem that this species is facing in Sussex, it's much more likely to be something that's happening in the breeding season, and perhaps it's something to do with the timing of their breeding in relation to the emergence of these caterpillars. But I'm just guessing here, if I'm honest. I'm now going to talk about roosts. Now, roosts are really important in hawfinch studies, because that's the only way really that you can count the birds. And here are three extraordinary facts about roosts. The first one is, unfortunately, they're very hard to find. You can be 200 meters from a roost and not know it's there, because the birds fly in really fast, and if you're not looking out for them, you can easily miss them. The next remarkable thing is these aren't isolated roosts. They all seem to be linked up. So at this site, this is Norway spruce, and they tend to roost in Norway spruce or Douglas fir, in my experience, and in the New Forest. So watching this site, some of the hawfinches during the influx would come in a flock, and they'd all land in the roost. And then some of them would fly straight on. None of them would land. And then other flocks, some of them would land and some of them would fly on. So we found out that there was another roost a bit further on, 1.5 kilometers away, and some of the hawfinches would fly over that one as well. So there seemed to be linked roosts through the countryside, and perhaps that's the way that hawfinches communicate about where the best food is. The other remarkable thing is that within 100 square kilometers of this roost, no hawfinches were ever found feeding during the influx. So you can just imagine how difficult it is to find these birds in a normal year, in a non-influx year. Extraordinarily difficult. Of all the pictures I show, this one here is the one that most captures what it's like to watch hawfinches. So you've got up at some unearthly hour in the morning, you've driven a long way in the dark in the middle of the winter, you're standing on a path waiting for it to get light, and then there's nothing around. You can maybe hear a tawny owl, but then suddenly just around sunrise, just after sunrises, hawfinches start to appear, and it's all worthwhile. This is really what it's like. So when you're watching a roost, it's important to know the timings of birds coming in and leaving. So they'll come into roost between 3.5 and 2 hours before sunset. So quite a long time before sunset. I always think it's because they need such a long time to digest all that food, but they come into roost really early, but over a protracted period. So it's not a great time to count them. In the morning, however, they all leave within about 5 or 10 or 15 minutes, from about 5 minutes before sunrise to about 15, maybe 20 minutes after sunrise. And those timings are very reliable. They're absolutely key to watching and counting these birds. So here's 3 more remarkable things about roosts. One is that they occur in such ordinary places. This is just near Rudyard Kipling's house, Bateman's, Darlington Forest. You may have been to Bateman's at least. So I found a roost in this tiny patch of spruce on the right there. And I thought, that's ridiculous. There's better spruce than that just out the back of my house, less than 1 kilometer away. So the next day I went to that site, just less than 1 kilometer from my house, and I found 127 hawfinches. And I started seeing them 300 meters from my house. And I've been studying them for about 4 months by then. So it was a bit of a blow to my ego to find that I'd been missing them so close to my house. One more extraordinary thing about roosts, we found them at all these roosts in the winters since the invasion. So there were 4 roosts found, maybe there were 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 across the county. Do they all have hawfinches in normal years? if they do, then there's certainly a lot more birds around than we thought. That's just a map showing how many tetrads hawfinches were found in and what density during the influx. If you remember my map of Hornbeam, and Yew is even more widespread, they were clearly a lot more widespread even than this map suggests. So I'm just going to finish on what we've learned since the influx. And this has been really, really exciting. So this site, which doesn't look anything special at all, is actually full of hornbeam and field maple, and there's cherry and beech as well. 200 hawfinches were found here, maximum count during the influx. And since then, we found flocks, single flocks of up to 45. And this was a site where no birds were ever known in this part of Sussex before the influx. And we've also found them in other 1 kilometre squares, other places around this site. So that was very, very exciting. Even better, I found juvenile hawfinches here in autumn. So this was a completely unknown site, and they're even breeding here. And this incidentally is where I took those pictures that I showed you right at the beginning. Moving further west, at the site where I showed you the photograph of the first roost, there were up to 9 hawfinches last winter. You can see there, by the way, all the white on the wing and that dumpy shape and the big head. That's a real help to identifying them. Then moving further west, Arundel, the woodland around Arundel, I'm sure many of you visited Arundel. We knew that there were 1 or 2 hawfinches there most winters. There were a lot during the influx. And since then, fortunately, we found the roost. So we know that there is about 30 using that one roost. So that was very exciting. Then further west from there, just in the last few weeks, a new site has been found southwest of Petworth at a place called Graffham Down, where hawfinches are following thrush flocks around, feeding on ewes and ewe seeds. And Kingley Vale, well, you'd think that would be the real hotspot with 400 during the influx, but I found it really difficult to detect hawfinches there. And the first time I went after the influx, I spent 5 hours there and I didn't see any, but eventually I saw 10 sitting up at the top of a tree, 10 brown hawfinch-sized birds. So sigh of relief, I was really chuffed. But when I got my binoculars onto them, they were waxwings. So kind of bittersweet moment, but it was really good to see the waxwings. There were 10 of them. So since then, we have worked out how to find hawfinches at Kingley Vale, but despite all you, for some reason, they don't seem to love it to death. Now I'm going to finish with the best site in Sussex in most years, most of the time, and that's Westdean Woods, which is north of Chichester, north of Kingley Vale. This is the site that I said was the honeypot site. Now we knew that there were many birds here, but after the influx, I started looking for them in summer and I found them. And then I went there at the beginning of September 2019, and I found a concentration of 50 hawfinches. This was way, way more than ever been found in summer in Sussex. And even more exciting, I was able to photograph this juvenile. This is a bird that is just completing its post-juvenile molt. It's still very yellow around the head. And I went back exactly the same day this year, and I didn't find 50 hawfinches. I found 85, which was probably the largest concentration anywhere in Britain at the time. And this in a county where we thought the birds were almost extinct. And most of the birds I could see were actually juveniles. So this is really exciting. Just thought I'd show you this picture. On the right there, you've got a hawfinch in wing molt. So this is an adult. This was taken in September. The bird on the left is a bit blotchy underneath and is not in wing molt. So that's a juvenile. And it may be that this site is used as a molting site by hawfinches from a wide area. They may even come from Surrey, may even come from the London recording area, who knows? So hopefully at least some of them breed in Sussex. This is just a map showing between the 15th of April to end of August 2018 to 2020. So compared with that earlier map of hawfinch presence in the summer, we found them at 4 times as many sites just in 2 summer seasons. So clearly hawfinches are doing a lot better than we thought. Now, is that because we got better at detecting them, or are they actually increasing? Is there some dark force at play? Well, if there is a dark force, it could be this. and no prizes for guessing that the bird on the left there's a goshawk, because that's the other bird I'm talking about. So goshawks take a lot of jays and squirrels, and also great spotted woodpeckers, and those are all predators of hawfinch nests. They take young hawfinches and hawfinch eggs. So it's possible. So it's just a wild theory at the moment. There's no real evidence for it. So I'm just going to say a little bit about how to identify goshawks. This is a picture by Mark Fassol, not by me. It's an adult female, but not a full adult, because a full adult will have grey barring, so grey on white below. Most female Sussex goshawks are brown above. The literature will tell you that they're grey, but they're mostly brown, although some of them are grey. A male goshawk is a good deal smaller. You can tell it from a sparrowhawk. It's still a lot larger even than a female sparrowhawk. It's got a much bigger, more protruding head, considerably longer wings, and usually seems to have a slightly more untidy tail. It also has a big white area on the secondaries and the inner primaries that you can see there, that white area at the back of the wing. And if you just fix on that, and I'm just going to show you a picture of a sparrowhawk, look at all that barring on the wing of a sparrowhawk on the secondaries, and also the much, much smaller head. So those are good ways of telling the two apart. Clearly, if they're a long way away, it becomes more difficult to distinguish them. How big's a goshawk? Well, this is a female, an immature female, and it's a good deal bigger than a crow, although slightly smaller than a buzzard. Can you confuse a female goshawk with a sparrowhawk? Not really, not at this range anyway. So that huge bird below is the female goshawk, an immature, and the bird above is, I think, a female sparrowhawk. You can see it's massively bigger than a sparrowhawk. But the further the birds are away, the more difficult it is to identify them. Goshawks tend to fly with deep, languid, slow wing beats, which sparrowhawks almost never do, except when they're displaying. And a juvenile goshawk, immature goshawk, has this nice teardrop blotching underneath, or streaking it may have, against this almost rufous background. Quite a distinctive bird. This one, I was lucky enough to have it fly right over my head. What's been happening to goshawks in Sussex? Well, there's a lot of secrecy surrounding the species. So we don't really know if the increase has been quite as extreme as this graph suggests, but there has definitely been a very, very rapid increase. 2015, it also coincided with my retirement, so there may be a bit of observer bias in there, but I'm absolutely sure that the increase has been very rapid from the field work we've done. They may suffer a bit of persecution here and there, but they're not suffering a lot of persecution. And all the evidence suggests, really, from what we know of this bird, it's an apex predator. It has no enemies except humans. There are no eagle owls in Britain, or very few, and certainly none in Sussex. So it should keep increasing, which is excellent news. And they're now very close to urban areas. So they're not in towns. You know, in Germany, in Berlin, they breed in the Tiergarten, in the zoo. Well, we're not quite there yet, but we may get there in the future when all the optimum sites are occupied. But for the moment, goshawks occupy mature mixed woodland. This is really important. So mature mixed coniferous, and coniferous really means spruce, Douglas fir, maybe western hemlock. Large tracts of pine, Scots and Corsican pine, are not so attractive, although they will nest in Scots pine. So this is the kind of place where you might find them. And this is actually near Netherfield, the place in East Sussex, where you can see Hawfinches. So it's quite possible to see both species in one day, although not in this year because there's no hornbeam around here. Now, when to see them? Well, everybody used to say you have to see them when they're displaying and they're otherwise invisible. That isn't true at all, but it is true that during the display period is a really good time to see them. And that can be from almost now, certainly from December, right through to the end of March. And the females, this is a female, an adult female, they fly with deep, languid, powerful wing beats quite low over their nesting area, with their undertail covers fluffed out. And if you're looking at one, keep an eye out above her, because the male might be above her and he might do some wonderful switchbacks And during that display, he dives down very fast, flapping his wings very fast, and then shoots upwards with his wings closed, and will repeat that. The sparrow has a similar display, but it doesn't do it with such intensity. And with the numbers of goshawks now in Sussex, you'll have more than one bird competing for a territory. So this is the second calendar year female goshawk above with a near adult female below, and they're competing for the territory. You can see the bird above showing a bit of aggression with her talons lowered. By early April or the end of March, the females will vanish. They'll be down on eggs and then looking after the young. This picture was taken in late May. It's in a Scots pine. You can see the nest is apparently quite well camouflaged, but I assure you it's incredibly obvious from the ground, as goshawk nests usually are. There are at least 2 birds in this nest, and I think you can see one of them just poking out there. So as I said, at this point, you won't see the females, but you'll see you probably won't see the males either, actually, because they're mainly hunting within the canopy of the woods, and they're provisioning the young and the female. This is a picture again by Mark Fassel, showing a goshawk, male goshawk, with probably a pigeon that it's just plucked and is going to take back to the nest. Then by early June, the young are really quite well grown. This is a different nest, but also in the Scots pine. And then by the middle of June, they will be some of the nests, at least the early nests, the young will be flying. So from the second half of June, the young are flying. And you might have read that this is not a good time to see them, but it's actually a wonderful time to see goshawks, because the young play together and spar in the sky, generally 2 males or 2 females, because it may be a bit risky for a male to spar with a much larger female. So these are 2 female goshawks sparring together in the sky. And right through from when they start flying in late June or July through to September, you can see this. And they seem to just love flying anyway, because you see the juveniles a lot. And they like baiting other birds. They particularly like having a go at buzzards. They are picked on in turn, by the way, by crows, the young birds, not the adults. They'll also have a go at honey buzzards, not to kill them, but just to annoy them, which is a bit worrying if you're interested in honey buzzards as well as I am. But this picture, rather like the Hawfinch picture at the roost, that grey picture on a January morning, this is how you will most often see goshawks. This kind of epitomizes what it's like to watch goshawks. They stooge around at mid-altitude. This is an immature female, quite lazily, and then they might suddenly dive vertically or dive at a 45-degree angle and fly at increasing speed, maybe 1.5 kilometers, and they're going after wood pigeons. And when wood pigeons see goshawks, they go absolutely crazy. They're terrified of them. So if you're ever in Sussex in an area of mixed woodland and all the wood pigeons get up and start flying around like mad, you've got a goshawk in the air with them without any doubt at all. But they don't just take wood pigeons. You might think they do, because the only birds you see them hunting really are wood pigeons. But I just collected these items from below a goshawk nest. So in the middle there, you've got a racing pigeon ring. Above it, you've got 2 little jay feathers. Above that, a squirrel lower jawbone. Below the yellow ring, you've got 3 great spotted woodpecker feathers. So those are some of the birds that might predate hawfinches, by the way. And the rest of the feathers are probably corvids and perhaps remains of pigeons, and there are a couple of pellets there as well. So the food of goshawks is quite diverse, but you generally don't see them hunting most of these creatures, because they do so within the canopy of the woods, and you just don't see it. They do take other things. On the left there are sparrowhawk feathers. They do kill sparrowhawks, and it's thought in some areas, certainly in the New Forest, that the population of sparrowhawks is declining because of the increasing goshawks. On the right there, I don't know how many of you have guessed what that is a feather of, but it's actually rather sadly the feather of a cuckoo. So the cuckoo seems to have been predated by the goshawk. Now, where to see goshawks in Sussex? they're honestly now so widespread that provided you pick the right habitat that I've described, you should see them and pick the right season as well. So it's really above that red line. Avoid the river valleys, choose the slightly higher ground and big areas of mixed mature woodland. That's where you're going to find them. You can also find them on the South Downs, north of Chichester, near the Hawfinch sites, and also below the red line between Battle and Heathfield there, north of Battle. There's also a population there. So they're doing really well, and it's very, very exciting. And they're some of the most wonderful birds to watch. They're one of those birds that you don't really tire of watching them, however many you see. So that's my summary. One pair in 1990, there are 35 pairs now. That's the habitat. Find a viewpoint on a nice day. Choose a nice day because it's more fun for you and you're more likely to see goshawks. Anyway, a bit of breeze is good, by the way, something above force 3, a friend of mine always advises. And be patient. So give it a couple of hours, 3 hours ideally. Watch for panicking wood pigeons. Done. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Mark. I thought that was a really fascinating talk, and I love the way you just conveyed the excitement of watching birds and discovering more about them and really observing a species and getting to understand it and unpick its behaviour. I thought that was, I was like there with you, which was really fantastic. That was great. I like the way how detailed you were kind of doing such detailed observing. And I thought the other thing that particularly interested me was thinking about the food, particularly for the hawfinch, actually locating the species that it's feeding on, like the hornbeam and the yew, is a really good way to narrow down where might be good sites to look for it. So it hadn't occurred to me to look to kind of like to think in such a detailed way, because I'm interested in botany particularly, and it was kind of just really interesting to see the kind of interconnection. I've seen there's a few questions coming through in the chat. So are you okay if we go on to some questions now?
Yes, that's fine.
That's great. Okay, so Anko, if you want to pick up a couple of questions from the chat, and if people would like to ask questions in person, we have got a few minutes, so do just put your blue hand up, which you can do by going to the participants section, and we'll see if we can bring a couple of people in to ask questions in person if you'd like. So over to you, Anko, initially.
Yeah, the first question is from Beverly, and sorry, my voice is gone here. And I was also curious about this because you were talking about the caterpillars and the hawfinch, and she says there's talk about problems with global warming causing caterpillars to appear earlier than before, which often means birds aren't in sync with them. Could this be a problem for hawfinches as well?
Yes, it hasn't been proven, but that's precisely the problem, and this has been proven with the increasingly rare lesser spotted woodpecker. So a colleague of mine, Ken Smith, who's been studying lesser spotted woodpeckers, has demonstrated that they are breeding out of sync with the larvae and caterpillars on which they depend. So it may well be a problem with hawfinches. It's just that the research hasn't been done to demonstrate whether that actually is so or not.
Right, so that's your next project.
Maybe. You need to find a lot of breeding hawfinches.
It would be really interesting to find out, though, definitely. And then Sophie was asking, do you think that the hawfinches were in those sites before the influx?
They were certainly in some of them, yes. So the site in East Sussex, the site near Netherfield, I've no doubt that they were there, but nobody had ever been there. You know, bird watchers tend to go to the well-known sites, and also if they're doing surveys like the breeding bird surveys, those are not done in a manner that is likely to detect hawfinches. So you'll know from my talk you have to be out at a particular time of day or night, and you have to watch in a particular way. Hawfinch bird watching is not bird watching. You're either bird watching or you're hawfinch watching. It's very difficult to combine it with other things.
And then Ernie was saying that hawfinches used to be common at Bedgebury Pinetum in Kent, but are a lot less common now on the site. Where have they dispersed to?
Well, the East Sussex site that I mentioned is very, very close to Bedgebury. It's probably less than 10 miles away. But Bedgebury is a huge area, so it's possible that they're still there. And again, you know, from my talk, you'll know that you know, you have to watch in a very specialised and persistent way. So the first place I'd go to look for hawfinches in Kent would be Bedgebury, and I'd keep looking pretty much until I found them. I'm sure there are some there.
So Ernie will have to go back and look a bit more then. And then a more technical question. Michelle Galt was asking, how were the abundance of hawfinches worked out? I.e., did you count the individuals in the morning with binoculars? So, I mean,
Yeah.
how did you work out abundance?
It's very easy to count a roost in the morning because what the birds will do, sorry, I should have said this during the talk actually, when they come out in the morning, they'll either fly straight out in small flocks and they'll all be out within 15 minutes, so it's easy to count them. Some of them may perch up in the trees as well before they fly off, but it's really easy because they just fly off and you can count them, you know, even if you're like 150 meters away, because they're very distinctive with shape. You can't mistake them for anything else. Then in the evening, when they come into roost, they tend to, some of them tend to perch up in the treetops before they disappear into the roost. But it's a bit kind of messy in the afternoon. You could be double counting. So if you want to count them, you really have to do it in the morning.
Right, and kind of at the same time then, just for methodological purposes,
Yeah.
I would think too.
So just to say, if there's anyone who would like to ask a question in person, there is just a few more minutes if you'd like to do that. So we've got plenty of questions in the chat, so that we can carry on with those. But if anybody would like to ask in person, then you are most welcome to do that. Thanks, Anka, if you want to carry on though, because I know we've got a lot, I can see a lot more questions coming.
Yeah, they keep appearing. They're like magical. So Michelle Galt actually has another question for you. Also, why do you think, I mean, just your opinion, hawfinches had such a sudden influx in 2017?
I think it was certainly a massive crop failure. So hornbeam and beech, we know, failed in parts of Eastern Europe. And the other possible reason is that there was a storm called Storm Ophelia, and that it's possible that it blew the hawfinches off course because their normal trajectory of migration from Eastern Europe is towards the southwest. They go towards northern Italy and Spain, so they may have been blown off course, but it's primarily a failure of food. And
David Black wants to know if you saw goshawks predate other birds off of prey nests, for instance, the honey buzzard.
Yes, it has been known. We found an adult, I study honey buzzards as well, by the way. We found an adult female honey buzzard killed by a goshawk. And we certainly found, I think it was last year, found a juvenile that we'd ringed was killed by a goshawk. But they do tend to coexist. They nest quite close together. The goshawk season is over before honey buzzard eggs even hatch. And so there's still some risk from adult goshawks. We don't think there's a risk from juvenile goshawks. They may make a bit of a nuisance of themselves, but they don't predate honey buzzards, we think. So there is a risk. You know, there was a honey buzzard nest I was monitoring this year that was really close to lots of goshawks, and they seem to have reared the young successfully. So, you know, they've coexisted in the world for hundreds of thousands of years. So goshawks won't render honey buzzards extinct.
Good. I've got a question from Kennedy Cruikshank, who's asking, do we know what proportion are migrating internationally from these roosts?
No, I'd love to know. I was about to start a project actually this winter to ring hawfinches, and you know, maybe we'd eventually been able to put, you know, satellite trackers on them and work out where they were going. But because of this failure of hornbeam in East Sussex, the place that I was going to try and catch them, there don't appear to be any hawfinches. So it's a project for the next year. And of course, you need to catch quite a lot of hawfinches in order to get controls from other parts of Europe. There are controls from between Norway or Scandinavia and Wales, by the way. So we know that Scandinavian hawfinches do come to Wales. So Yolo Williams on Autumn Watch reckoned that this was I think the last or one of the most recent episodes of Autumn Watch, reckoned about 10 to 15,000 hawfinches come into Britain every year from the continent. I'm not sure where that figure comes from, but it sounds quite plausible to me.
And Charlotte was wondering, are there any forms of persecution of the goshawk in your study area?
I haven't been able to prove it, but I suspect that either on some estates, there may be some disturbance of goshawks of some kind. There may be, but I think it's it's very localized if it occurs at all.
And you were talking about the hornbeam failure. There's another question that's kind of sort of related. Will the failing forests in Central and Eastern Europe due to drought impact more going forward? This is from Janet Kaiser.
Sorry, I didn't quite get all that.
Will the failing forests in Central and Eastern Europe due to drought impact more going forward?
Yes, I would say there are vastly larger hawfinch populations in those parts of Europe than in Britain. So were those forests to really deteriorate, that might well affect hawfinches more severely than anything that's happening in the UK. It's not a subject I know anything about.
I'm not sure if this is referring to the hawfinch or the goshawk, but will they breed in just mature or ancient woodland, or can they survive in secondary habitat?
It probably relates to hawfinch, I think, and I think they can. Yeah, they can survive in secondary habitat. I mean, everywhere. I don't think there's any sort of real. Well, sorry, there is quite a lot of ancient forest in Sussex, but the areas where we know that they breed are not, I don't think, ancient woodland.
And Michelle Galtz asked another question. She's doing her master's, so this is why she's got so many questions. But she's got one last question. The hornbeams, you said they were in abundance due to industry in the area. How were they used in industry with the hornbeams?
Hornbeam. So hornbeam, its name means hard wood, and it burns at a very, very high temperature. So that's why it was used for making charcoal, which I think in turn was used for smelting iron. It's also used, for example, to make cogs on sort of water wheels, for example, because the wood is so strong. So it's a very important tree. I don't think it's so important anymore, but the remnants of all that industry are plain to see in Sussex.
And then Gayan wants to know, is anyone satellite tagging hawfinches and goshawks in Britain?
I'm not sure. I can't answer that question authoritatively. I'm sorry. I don't know.
And a final question. I think we've got a few more minutes. Well, this is we're now kind of going into the botanical realm of things, but is the hornbeam suitable as a garden tree? I think Jan Tallis would like to bring the hawfinch into her garden now.
Actually, probably realised from my talk you need to be as much a botanist as an ornithologist to be hawfinches. It's possibly even more important. So I'm a keen gardener as well. Hornbeam's usually used as a very beautiful hedge. I think Monty Don's got a hornbeam hedge at Longmeadow. But they trim the hedges in a manner that means that they never fruit, which is a bit unfortunate. But there's nothing to stop you planting a hornbeam in your garden. The trouble is, it'll take a long time to grow, and unless it's close to lots of other hornbeams, you're pretty unlikely to attract hawfinches. You'd be better off planting a cotoneaster. You might get waxwings.
So we've probably got time for maybe one or two quick questions before we round off.
Yeah, we've got one from Siobhan, which is, do you think their ecology and behavioral ecology is fully understood for both species?
I think for goshawk, probably the answer is pretty much yes. I think for Hawfinch, definitely not, because the only really good recent research that's been carried out by the RSPB, and it's super piece of work, demonstrates that in Wales, where they're still a few places where they're still quite common, they're doing very well, and that's clearly so. That research is not really transferable to, say, Sussex, because it's a very different story here.
Okay, David would like to ask something. He's waving a non-virtual hand. Hiya, David. Yeah, you've unmuted yourself. So would you like to ask your question directly to Mark? That's great.
Yes, the printed system failed me entirely. I did try it, but it didn't work. It's just to say that Hornbeam has been mentioned in some contexts tonight, and I wanted to encourage people to come and listen to me on Thursday when I'll be saying a lot about Hornbeam. Both as a garden tree and in other contexts. So do please come and listen. Thank you.
That's great, David. That's great. I was going to give you a plug later, but you stepped in about yourself. That's perfect. Thank you very much. Can I just ask one quick thing as well, which is about the goshawk and being in Berlin in quite urban areas. What is there a difference in attitude towards goshawks that's made that happen, or is there some difference in habitat? What's the reason why that's happened, in that particular place?
Well, funnily enough, as a child, I lived in Berlin, and I had a game called Jagdspiel, where you got points for killing animals, for going hunting, and you got quite a lot of points for killing a goshawk.
Okay.
I'm revealing my age here, but this was in the late 1950s, early 1960s. In Germany, goshawks were killed in the 50s and 60s, but attitudes completely changed, and now it's something that the Berlin Zoo is famous for.
That's great, yeah, and it would be interesting to see whether, as the populations rise in county that's not far away, obviously from us, from London, it will be interesting to see whether something like that shifts in the future here as well. Certainly look forward to finding out more. And thank you so much, Mark, for a really fascinating talk. I think people have been so kind of engaged with it. We've had lots of interesting questions, and it's certainly inspired people, I think, to go out and really kind of like get to grips, understand birds and find out as much as we can about them. So thank you for sharing all your kind of great research and your great care and passion for those species, and I'm sure for others as well.